Welcome to this introduction video from the Derby Research School. We're really excited to share that the EEF has launched its Improving Primary Science Guidance Report. This is a sister guidance report that sits alongside the Improving Secondary Science Guidance Report. And there was always a rich evidence base in there around effective practice for the teaching of science that will relate to all age ranges, but this is very much a specific dedicated to primary alongside that sister guidance report that we're very, very pleased to share. So let's get stuck in and see what the guidance report has to offer us as practitioners. So in the first instance, what we have is the kind of evidence base around where has this report come from. So they evaluated around 15,000 studies and found that 90 of them have the most robust and relevant evidence and synthesized that into the report. So when you're accessing that guidance report, what you're getting is a lot of hard work that's gone in the background to really, really distill down the strongest evidence, the best bets for you in schools. Around that, then they've taken it through several different lenses to see about its applicability and relevance to our primary colleagues and to us as a teaching profession. So you see there's 6 domains that they've looked at that lens to ensure that they really think about what that evidence is supporting us to do in the classroom. So there you can see it's about involving an approach to teaching, learning or assessing primary science. They've ensured that it is about reporting pupil outcomes, focusing on the teaching of science, very much looked at the age ranges of 5 to 11, where the research has trended towards using a comparison group to really get that robust evidence base, and where the research has been published between January 2007 to September 2021. So that gives you an idea of the process around which that they did to kind of pull this guidance together. So let's have a look at the recommendations themselves. So there are 6 core recommendations that are across the guidance report, and we're going to have a quick walk through each one. So here are the 6 on a page. You can have a little scan through that for yourselves. But you see there's some really, really rich opportunities there to not only boost the explicit teaching of science and really maximise on that teaching and learning potential, but also some really good strategies that will link to quality first teaching, high quality teaching that we know from the off. So that kind of anchoring in core teaching and learning, core pedagogy and practice, it reiterates a lot of those strong messages we'll be having in our schools. But there are some really, really strong examples of subject-specific pedagogy and implementation, subject-specific pedagogy and strategies that link directly to the teaching of science. So let's have a little walk through. First one is making sure that pupils develop their scientific vocabulary so that they can effectively participate in science learning and communicate their understanding. And these are 2 critical, that kind of oracy around science is really, really important. So there's 2 key recommendations for practitioners about, first of all, being very selective, identifying the science-specific vocabulary that we want to teach, and then second part of that is explicitly teaching those new words and their meaning, and being really intentful with the way in which we do that. And a second part of that recommendation there is all about creating those opportunities for repeated engagement and use over time. So we're saying not just that setup of new vocabulary, but we're really embedding them into the classroom environment and really enabling pupils to start to internalize that language for themselves. There's a really nice visual which goes back to that tiered approach to vocabulary that we see in all vocabulary instruction, or quite a lot of vocabulary instruction comes back to this tiered approach. And it really helps us to think about how we're grouping. What I like is it talks about this polysemous vocabulary, words that have an everyday meaning and a science scientific meaning, really focusing in on those words that may appear to be either in tier 1 or tier 2, but actually have a science specific meaning as well, as those can be those kind of pitfalls for some of our learners who've never had them explicitly articulated as to the difference of them. And a nice, obviously, example there of the force is strong with this one. Obviously, everyone likes a science joke thrown into the equation. But yeah, so hopefully this is a nice sort of starting point for colleagues who are looking to identify that vocabulary. And going into the second part of the recommendation, we do here have then the explicit teaching, and then embedding it over time. What's really nice about this is this framework around those 4 strategies of modelling the new use, creating the context for words that need to be learned, exposing children to new vocabulary across all literacy activities, and use vocabulary approaches that promote rich language connections. You can clearly see that would be a really strong framework to, as a practitioner, plan over a 3-week window, over a extensive window, potentially over a half term, if you want to go to that degree, about how we are choosing, selecting, introducing and modelling that new word, and how we're then really planning, deliberately planning over time to do these other additional around creating a context, exposing children to the new vocabulary across a range of literacy activities, and those vocabulary approaches that promote rich language connections. The guidance report goes into a few more practical examples of what these look like, but we can really see a strong opportunity for us to really look at that disciplinary literacy application of explicit teaching of vocabulary to support scientific language acquisition. Okay, second recommendation is very much about making thinking explicit, whether verbally or in written form. And we definitely want to give pupils the opportunity to recall, organise and express their thoughts and ideas, refine their understanding and think scientifically. I think when we think of our more disadvantaged learners who may not have yet had some of these structured opportunities that have been made explicit to them, that maybe some of our learners have had in different parts of their different experiences that they've had, making it explicit will really open up the opportunities for all learners to actively engage in these scientific inquiry and scientific lessons that we want to deliver. You've got a 3-step structure here about that collaborative learning environment. There's a really lovely framework in there around collaborative learning, capitalising on that power of dialogue. So collaborative learning is creating opportunities to interconnect, the power of dialogue then being the quality of that dialogue, and then building their capacity and ability to reason and offer justification. So we create the conditions, maximize the opportunity and give them the tools to really develop their reasoning and justification skills. So in the first recommendation, part of this recommendation, the model in the guidance report breaks it down into 3 areas, where you look at the quality, the task design, the talk behaviours that we set up in the environment, and then the expectation setting within that. And these all kind of really underpin effective collaborative learning that we want to implement into our classroom. So really go into that page, have a little look at the qualities around that, and you can clearly see this is not just a science aspect, this is for any opportunity that we have in the classroom to learn collaboratively, which is pretty much nearly all of the time. So it's a really useful framework for colleagues. But again, in our science, when we're doing scientific inquiry, super important that we create these conditions. When we go to the second part of this recommendation about capitalising the power of dialogue, it looks at some really critical strategies. What I love about this guidance report, as you can see on the screen there, it uses lots of vignettes, lots of examples from the classroom, which make it really practical and accessible. So I will take a moment to point out how rich in pedagogy, how rich in primary practice this guidance report really is. So 3 of the strategies they look at was this idea of open-ended questions, strategic follow-up, and balancing teacher and pupil voice. So not only do they describe it, but they give you this practical example examples so you can see it in action. So don't miss out on that page. Then following on from that, the reasoning and justification thread, being really, really, really explicit about how we develop this. And here's a model about the explain, discuss, re-explain structure that we can again explicitly teach our pupils to really help build their reasoning and justification. So you can clearly see there you got the explain, pupils explaining their thinking through discussions and peers, etc., or in written form. And then discuss is people then engage in group or whole class discussion facilitated by this teacher. So it takes it to the next level up so that pupils can call on their own understanding, listen to new information and help consider other perspectives and really start to kind of interrogate their own thinking and come to a deeper understanding of what's happening. And then that process of re-explaining, pupils are given the opportunity to review and update their thinking after the discussion. This is it's very, very similar to some of those Socratic methods or of articulation, of building strong justification. You can clearly see this would be a really nice structure in a primary classroom to allow pupils to really build on their thinking, and that deliberate act of thinking and listening to others and considering different perspectives and being able to re-articulate their thinking, re-explain themselves in light of the new information. This whole idea about reviewing and updating really gives them the time to consider that they do not have to have the right answer first time, that we all build our answer. So this is a culture of learning piece as well around that reasoning and justification, and a really, really simple structure for classroom practice. So really important aspect, particularly if we're thinking about that thinking scientifically strand of work that we really want to create rich pathways for in our science practice. So that's recommendations 1 on vocabulary, 2 on thinking. 3 is then leading into them working scientifically. And those of you who are very familiar with the EEF's guidance reports will see here straight off the bat that 7-step model for metacognition. Very much echoing the gradual release model and that activating prior knowledge and explicit strategy instruction and that ownership. So it's very high teacher ownership at that stage, but gradually handing it over to guided practice, independence practice, to the pupils' ownership, their agency in their learning. So this is really nice that it's been taken and embedded into the science framework around working scientifically. So very much about explicit teaching the knowledge and skills required to work scientifically, guiding pupils to apply this in their practice, and making sure that we have those opportunities for discussion and reflection. What's super useful about this framework when you go in, it really breaks it down. I've just pulled out a couple of those examples there about what each of these stages relate to in terms of teacher practice, what makes high quality explicit instruction, what makes high quality modelling. These are some of the really, really useful statements that are in there. So in the first instance, I could definitely see myself using this in staff training to really help people think about the quality of their provision. It's also incredibly useful then as a framework in terms of going and observing practice and being able to offer really targeted feedback and offering colleagues, I can really see that you're considering children's working memory by using pause, repetition and processing time. What I'm not seeing enough opportunity of is that giving them time to rehearse new material through rephrasing, elaborating and summarising. You're jumping too quickly to guided or independent practice without that opportunity to rehearse that new material. I can see myself really, really using that very effectively to break down those small incremental steps in the explicit teaching. And again, this is super useful for science practice, but all of these aspects relate to high quality teaching. So it would benefit pedagogy and practice as a whole, as much as it's going to support getting people to work scientifically. To support you if you are looking at really reflecting and interrogating this concept, there is a really nice worked example of a Year 3 lesson on light and prediction that's available in the additional support materials. One of the things around this, however, is that this does not represent a lesson structure. Not all the steps need to be done in one lesson. The steps must be followed sequentially. And address the misconception that steps need to be followed sequentially. So again, a really nice practical examples for us as practitioners to see it in play. Another aspect, going back to that point that this is very, very rich in school-based examples for us to really interrogate it. So a real lovely feature of this new guidance report. We're now on to recommendation 4 out of the total 6. Really anchoring into relating learning to relevant real-world contexts. So making sure that we're in our in-class teaching and in outside of the classroom, we're really thinking about making sure it's relevant and real world, and on top of that, using virtual models. So you've got 2 aspects there about consider the real world context and then engage with science concepts supported by virtual models. I think this is a really interesting one because particularly for all of our practitioners, not all of us may have, particularly in a primary context, will have the subject specific subject knowledge, the depth of subject knowledge to really get to grips with this. So I think this is a really interesting framework to go back and review our curriculums and thinking really in our planning, in our curriculum intent, have we thought about that articulation about real world contexts, and how we will enable this in the classroom, and so that all of our staff, irrespective of their journey with science subject knowledge, can really maximize those opportunities. So I think recommendation 4 is a really interesting dimension to go back and do a bit of a curriculum review to see to what extent are we really maximizing this. So in the guidance report, it goes through those 2 aspects, and it's got some really nice frameworks and think pieces that allow us to consider it. So and the first one about considering real world context, planning your teaching so the context adds substantively to the learning, links closely to in-class learning, and fits into long-term curriculum planning. So again, that deliberateness in our curriculum implementation, about making sure that we're really that it's really consistent across our science curriculums. For example, you've got a nice example there of the sunglasses there. Using models, which is the second aspect there around using virtual models, really helps to make abstract concepts more tangible. It's very much about engaging all learners to actively engage in that in challenging learning. A good example of this is as adult learners, when we learn about working memory, long-term memory, we often use the concrete example of a working desk for our working memory, so we understand that we hold things there as a temporary working model, and our long-term memory is the filing cabinet. These are concrete examples, but models that we use to represent abstract concepts are really powerful for making complex things more digestible, more accessible. And if we're thinking about making sure that all learners, including our learners with SEND, our learners from a disadvantaged background, our learners with EAL, whose language may not be at a level that allows them to fully articulate using that vocabulary, they're growing in their vocabulary, it makes it really accessible to all learners. So hopefully some nice aspects to think there. And again, there's that whole recommendation invites a lot of reflection around practice and curriculum. Last 2 recommendations now, and it won't surprise you that assessment is one of those recommendations. Feedback to sit there at one of the top recommendations around the toolkit, around the EEF's toolkit. So it doesn't surprise me that assessment and that teaching for learning in the classroom is a real big driver. What is interesting about this is that it goes from that assessment recommendation states, that the assessment should be undertaken both before and during a topic, so that it to support science attainment and self-efficacy. So 3 subsections within this recommendation. about that explicit planning on planning of teaching that builds on existing knowledge and experience. So really, again, that curriculum design and intent. But if pupils have had gaps in their learning, which is what we are wrestling, we need to get under the bonnet around not what the intended curriculum, but to the taught curriculum. What have they been taught in reality? What have they retained in reality? So we can really think about their prior knowledge and their existing knowledge and experiences, potentially from wider experiences as well. Then coming back to responsive teaching feedback, the bread and butter of high quality teaching is in there in that second aspect. And then summarising what pupils have learned against planned criteria. So let's get under the bonnet from these then. The first part around planning teaching has a really interesting model for us to think about the recognise, reveal and respond model. Again, I can absolutely see myself really using this as a framework in my staff development, of really thinking about when we are planning lessons, that we are thinking really carefully about the recognise, reveal and respond. So really, it's 3R model, really basic, in terms of a framework that will really help me to think consistently. I mean, lots of practitioners who are really excellent at this do these things quite unconsciously. It's that unconscious competence where it's really innate for them. But if we can make it explicit for all of our practitioners, we can really maximize that learning and really that assessment of prior knowledge and existing knowledge and experiences. The second one then about responsive teaching and feedback, some lovely elements there around clarifying learning intentions and success criteria. That does come back down into your curriculum intent and implementation, from long-term planning into sequences of learning into the specific lesson, and eliciting what Dylan Williams calls eliciting evidence of learning. What are our strategies in the classroom that really tease out the experience of learning, that invisible learning in the head made explicit for us to really understand the learner experience, and making those in-flight adjustments, i.e. adaptive teaching in the moment, to really support responsive teaching for them. And the last I mentioned there about summarising what pupils have learned against planned criteria. We do know that there is a particular project that the EEF has undertaken about teacher assessment in primary science, TAPS, that you can dig a little bit into in the guidance report to really get under the bonnet of that around how we assess accurately our knowledge acquisition and our learning in the science domain. So some real practical experiences there in the design, the delivery and the assessment, all within this assessment to support learning and responsive teaching aspect. So some real strong nods towards what we may need to be really reflecting on our current practice. And last but not least, and I've woven hopefully this through the whole of the presentation, we really need to be thinking about how we put this in context of our professional development of staff. So I've tried to weave through, what I would be thinking about throughout this, what kinds of frameworks would be super useful, how that would feed into observations and staff feedback to really refine practice, where it is disciplinary in its application, whether it be disciplinary literacy or whether it's just good teaching across the board with a science lens. So hopefully you can see a real opportunity here through the frameworks within this guidance, through those recommendations, to really think about the quality of your professional development. And it does have a nice section there about identifying development priorities and professional learning needs in your staff around this domain. And we come back to acknowledging, and I nodded towards this, the subject knowledge, because we've come to primary teaching with a range of different degree backgrounds. So unlike in secondary, where you have to have a degree in the subject you choose to teach, in primary we come from a range of backgrounds, which means there will always be a variation in subject knowledge and teacher practice. And therefore we have to anticipate that and anticipate the so what. So what do I do to acknowledge there will always be a variability in staff subject knowledge? And that's one of the challenges, one of the real challenges of being a science lead in a primary context. Then looking at high quality professional development and those features of that, those mechanisms to really ensure that staff build and apply their knowledge in practice. And are motivated for that change. And then that aspect, then the last sort of thread there about senior leadership support from the strategic to the classroom level. So some real aspects there around, for our subject leaders, their leadership skills. And this is a really nice science-specific kind of reflective framework. And you can see on the next page some real nice reflective questions that allow you to think about those 3 domains. These are literally taken from the guidance report. And then some aspects around science leads and how they can be supported. So again, really nice opportunities to think and reflect, some real nice opportunities to look outward. And this is what the guidance report is very, very strong in inviting reflection, inviting continuous improvement, and offering some stimulus for thought there. And in the supportive materials, there's 2 bits that I would definitely recommend. There's a really, really nice sort of reflective framework there for our science leads, or if you are looking at your own practice as a classroom practitioner, there's some really nice reflective questions there that you can use. It's also a useful framework if you wanted to baseline where you were at one point and then use it as a tracking document for staff, maybe their confidence levels in each of the areas. And really using that to inform, going back to that point we just made about, really understanding staff need. Is it about their developing pupil scientific vocabulary, or are they less able to develop those opportunities for thinking scientifically, for example? So yes, so hopefully a really nice reflective framework here for both leaders and practitioners. And then if you are looking at drilling a bit more into your professional development, there's some really nice vignettes there, again just echoing back that this is really, really embedded into real classroom practice and some strong examples that make us think. So that was a whistle-stop tour of those 6 recommendations. Hopefully we've whetted your appetite enough to really get stuck into that, and you can see the applicability of so much of that across the curriculum. So some great tools and resources for primary practitioners, full stop in there. If you are interested in going underneath the bonnet and really, really thinking about this, the Research School Network has a range of blogs that have been published across the country from a range of research schools that are really unpicking those recommendations. You can see there about why do words matter in science, the working scientifically 7-step model, the use of concept cartoons to support collaborative learning and articulation. So just some really rich opportunities where practitioners and leaders across the country have been really reading this already, because we prepared them in advance of the launch. So you might find something that if you think about those 6 recommendations and you're really thinking, actually, that's the area we need to focus in on, have a look at how somebody else has been really wrestling with it, how they've been reflecting on it, and that might give you a little taster of something to help you in your journey. So I think that's the 6 recommendations done, and we look forward to schools really getting into this guidance report. And if you do have any feedback around how you're using this in your setting and how you're implementing this, don't hesitate to get in touch with myself and Amy at the Research School, and we look forward to hearing about your journeys. Thank you very much, and we wish you the best with this new guidance report.